Okay, thank you, Nat. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the incremental work in this session. We're going to talk a bit about how this then overlaps with the other tools and research methods we've been talking about. I've got the added advantage today of a lot of this stuff we've already talked about this morning. It's going to be a bit of a rehash. I've literally only got maybe 4 slides of content. We're going to spend most of the time talking about our experiences with the retail side. So to explain this one for starters, I had originally gone through Meta AI and I was trying to find something as a better stock image. It wasn't like a person holding a mobile phone. And so I keyed in for incremental effects and accidentally hit the generate button instead. And this is what AI thinks incremental effects looks like in terms of an image gen. You can go even creepier and animate it and do the rest. And I can now claim that we've done an AI presentation as part of MeasureUp. So getting that one out of the way, what we'll spend most of this session talking about will be some of these cases from incrementality in action. I'll give about 5 or 6 minutes to start with just around some of the frameworks we talk about. Some of this will be a bit of a revisit on topics we've already covered. And then we're going to bring up Brian and Joe to talk a bit more about their experience over the last 12 months, working with incremental testing, and more importantly, how we're weighing up some of these tools against other research techniques and approaches. So again, areas we've covered a bit already this morning, but we'll spend a bit more time with some Q&A on that front. So with that as a bit of a forewarning, and I'm looking partly at JJ here as well, we do want to have some open questions around this. We'll take a couple of breaks in between that sort of session. If you want to ask stuff from the floor, please feel free. We'll prompt that up front, so you've got more than 7 seconds to think about questions as we go through. All right, so first of all, this particular model that we've sort of been talking about is Measurement 360, which you'll notice down the bottom is from September 2022. So before Gay tackles me off stage for using older content, we did actually present this at a previous MeasureUp as well. And this idea of continuous testing improvement, integrating a number of research and analytical tools. We can do some callbacks to earlier on. So I think from the game theory sort of content, we even had a bit of a talk about using the right metrics and objectives at the top. How we integrate that into testing. We've talked a couple of times about first-party data and different sources. We can probably get into a little bit of that as part of the Q&A as well. And this part around triangulation and a test and learn approach. And this is probably what we spent a bit of time talking at MeasureUp last year, and we'll focus a bit on today with some deeper cases. For those that haven't seen something like this, if we take a heap of measurement tools and components, we try and map that out on a couple of axes. So incrementality is something we've looked at for a long time with Meta. We've been running on-platform experiments for at least 10 years or longer. And ideally, we've always tried to position things around, can we make things causal? Can we try and prove things in isolation? Now, across the other way, and of course, what we're looking for is more business-related metrics. We've had a couple of mentions this morning around likes and clicks and other proxies in between. But ideally, if we're looking at things that are more related to revenue, customer loyalty, potentially some of the areas around brand, but ultimately, what's a business worry about, more so than what the media metrics look like underneath. And so as we start to stick a few different methodologies and techniques on that, now I'm using the term attribution loosely, and we'll come back to that a couple of times as well. Things like clicks, often seen as both a proxy metric and really not causal. We run an ad, we get a number of clicks, and we go from there. Things like split testing. So does my creative A versus B work better? Partly experimental, but still often in that sort of proxy case. Do I get more clicks or more views when I show ad A versus B? And this kind of shift or push towards MMM in the last few years has been a fairly big piece. And we've probably already covered some of the reasons for that, but this gradual shift in terms of having less data and signal linked to a pixel and things we could have done through attribution and purely online in the past. In a lot of cases, it's groups like e-com businesses now moving into having TV and print and other channels. And that's been a massive part of our time, has been thinking about how these tools get used as well. And then over on the right, the more experimental pieces. Now, arguably, brand tracking in a test and control environment is still something of a proxy, but it is very much from the causal end. And ideally, done well, what we're looking at is the metric that matters most to you and in as causal a way as possible. And so in the purest view of measurement, we should be doing more up and to the right, like every other graph you've ever seen. Now, in practice, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So if we take a couple of tools, and I'm going to walk over here partly because the Google guys did actually mention pretty much the same thing, and I'm going to rehash similar terrain. If we take the MMM side, so whether they call it econometrics, market mix modelling, take your pick. But ultimately, what are the sort of strengths and weaknesses of that approach to research? And really, it's mainly about this sort of cross-channel feel. Can I take a whole bunch of tools, a whole bunch of channels of media, and get a good sense of how they work together? Arguably, when we first presented this over on the right, we actually would have said speed is relatively low, given that a lot of advertisers might have been doing this quarterly or annually. And arguably, that's probably improved over time. We're working with a number of groups that probably update their data, if not their model, on even a monthly or weekly basis. So maybe speed's less of an issue. Will Marks did mention earlier, though, of course, that if you haven't run a piece of activity in a particular channel, you won't have any data for it. So the other limitation of MMM is, of course, if it's not been run, we've got no way of looking at what it does. So testing-wise, in experiments, now whether that's on platform with different groups or if it's geo-testing, anything that's really giving you a proper testing control, how do we sort of weigh up the benefits and trade-offs? And arguably the accuracy piece around trying to get a causal view is where the strengths are for experimentation. But kind of by definition, you're picking one specific channel or one particular piece, and therefore your scope's reduced. And then as we kind of talk loosely about attribution, now whether that's analytics tools, ads reporting, or MTA type work, the real strength's often in speed. So can I plug stuff in, see real-time outcomes from it, and track that through? But with the trade-off of being it's often not causal. Maybe there's some crossover there in scope as we're able to add more data sources in. This has probably been more of a challenge in the last 3 or 4 years, just around the changes we've seen in digital signal in terms of getting data into those approaches. And if you're into the sort of noughts and crosses thing, you connect 3, and lo and behold, you've got a few strengths that play off between the different approaches. And so arguably, can we take the best pieces of each of these tools and try and work those together into sort of a meaningful learning plan for an advertiser? So this is probably a really basic way of putting it up on a slide, but a number of discussions we've had in the last couple of years have been around using all of it. And I think this is where a few of the discussions have gone today already. This idea that we can use media mix modelling as a way of looking at the umbrella across all channels, and how do we look at the balance between them, where the efficiencies can lie. Arguably, for day-to-day reporting, can we see what volume of ads is being served and how it's being delivered in a very real-time environment? And then potentially using experimentation more to dive into individual tactics, placements, comparing one creative to another, one audience to another, and trying out new pieces. The piece in the middle that we've probably seen more of in the last 18 months is using less of the individual tactic and more about, can we put more experimentation at a channel level? And in the process of doing that, maybe take a step up and look at it in a bigger sense. And then even start to compare that against what our real-time and MMM approaches look like. So if I run my calibration piece and my channel says you're delivering X conversions or X results, does it line up with what I'm seeing day to day in my attribution tools? And this is the part we'll talk about a little bit with the guys in a second. So that's it. Literally 4 models on the slides, first couple of minutes. We're going to spend the rest of the time having a bit of a chat about some examples. So if we can welcome up Brian and Joe to the stage, and we'll have a bit of a chat about their experience with experimentation. All right, so JJ, you're on a tablet. So any questions, we'll kind of pause a couple of bits in there.
Okay.
All right, so first of all, welcome. And I think most of the audience probably knows a little bit about sort of the businesses of Spotlight and P&O. Maybe to sort of start with, just to tell folks a little bit about your particular role and what sort of function you cover within. Maybe to start with, have you guys swapped around?
We have. Do I just do a swap?
No, it's all good, it's all good. Just mentally, swap the pictures.
To clarify, I'm Joe.
Yes, I was going to say. Either way, let's start with Joe. If you want to start with in terms of your role and start with P&O.
Yep, so I'm the digital marketing manager at P&O. I'm responsible for looking after all the paid digital channels alongside our agency partners, but crucially working with our commercial teams to ensure our ships sail full of happy cruisers.
Hey, I'm Brian from SRG, so that's Spotlight Retail Group. Under our umbrella, we have obviously Spotlight, but also Anaconda, everything outdoors, and also Harris Scarf, so department store focusing on kitchen, homeware. I run our paid social media team, and we run like an internal agency, so everything from campaign planning and strategy and execution of paid social.
So look, we hinted at a little bit earlier there in terms of trying to go from proxies to more of a a real business metric. So from your point of view, maybe starting with Brian, what does the business care about most? Is it revenue, number of customers? Is it new people, existing customers?
For us, the key focus is always going to be about revenue. So yeah, very much so. High-low retailer, looking at both online and in-store.
Okay. And in terms of loyalty program, is sort of gaining customers on that side?
Yeah, very much so. So a big percentage of our customer base are VIPs. So we're always looking to grow that as well.
Okay. And from the P&O point of view?
And yeah, surprise, surprise, sales, revenue, that's the kind of key measure of success for us. But I mean, within that, we're obviously trying to capture demand, but it's about growing demand. So if we have to source 50% of our customers as new to cruise, and that's obviously a bit of a hard sell for many people out there. So you have a big awareness and consideration job to do. But at the bottom line, it's obviously all sales.
Look, we talked a bit about sort of during the prep component as well. How much have things changed over the last few years? Both around the signal side, we've talked a bit about sort of COVID impacts on the two business models. How have the businesses sort of morphed through that period in terms of what they care about and how they go about it?
Yeah, so COVID was probably the biggest change that we've had over the last few years, and that really comes down to previously us being very offline focused. So if you think about Spotlight, a lot of sort of smaller items, cheaper items that you want to kind of touch and feel in store, and then Anaconda, almost kind of the opposite, lots of large items that can be expensive when we're shipping them all over Australia. So both those brands really lend themselves to shopping offline, and that's where our focus was. Then COVID happened and everything changed. So we probably did about many years worth of digital transformation, but over just a few months. So now what comes on the back of that is more of a focus on digital media as well.
And Joe, COVID was fun for
yeah, we had a really fun time during COVID. Yeah, no surprises. Cruise had a bit of a rough time. Yeah, so I mean, pre-COVID, the cruise industry was, let's say, 60%, 70% driven by travel agents and our trade partners. Post-COVID, that's flipped. So there's this huge reliance and appetite to be growing our direct channels pretty much overnight. So, there's suddenly where we were the plucky direct team just working in the background, suddenly that scrutiny is very much on marketing and direct to be filling those ships and growing that demand that was previously being facilitated by the trade agents. So, yeah, it's been a real shift.
So has that sort of affected the way that you look at media as well, in terms of the metrics you would track in terms of saying, well, this channel's doing a good job or that one's doing a less good job?
Yeah, I suppose the key difference has been, that you have to be able to start quantifying what your media is doing. Surprise, surprise, marketing budgets didn't change, but that mix of booking source obviously changed. So suddenly there's a huge more reliance to be making sure that every dollar counts and you can start quantifying what they're bringing in for you. And with that, knowing that you've still got to source 50% of your customers as new to cruise, there's going to be so much more reliance to be doing top of funnel, upper funnel work that's still going to ultimately convert in the bottom funnel.
So, and that might sort of bridge to that one, because it's part of one of the things we want to talk about is, I guess, how you think about attribution. So this idea that upper and lower funnel kind of get treated differently. I intentionally hinted earlier at sort of being very vague about what attribution means, because to some people that's an MTA model, to some it's about using an ad reporting tool that happens to have an attribution window in it. What does attribution mean to your sort of businesses?
I think it's different for different channels. So whether it's more traditional type channels or digital channels, they kind of get treated differently, to be honest. So it's a little bit unfair, I would say. Digital channels definitely get a lot more scrutiny.
I'm tempted to ask a bit more on that. So offline channels, how are they?
Yeah, I think Retail, really, everywhere I've ever worked, it's always about comping year on year. So there's a lot of hesitancy to change what we did the year previously. So it's always kind of about maintaining traditional spends and really fighting with data to show why we should be increasing digital spends.
For Pino?
I'm going to call it what it is. Attribution is an almighty pain in the arse. It is, you know, we are dealing with so many different data sources and we have such an over-reliance on last touch that really, how do you know really what your media is doing? And that's, you know, we're talking everything, you know, click-based here. We're not even considering what impressions are doing. And so, you know, as a business and, you know, when you're talking to different teams, whether you're talking to your commercial team, your marketing team, or your media agency partners, everyone's looking at a different source of truth. And it's how do you kind of get the data in between? I mean, take an example of between agency and clients. Clients, and I come from agency, so I spent my time in platforms looking at pixel data and was always confused when you speak to your brands and they're like, well, you know, brand managers, but they're like, oh, well, I'm not seeing that in GA. And so, of course, naturally, there is this huge, you know, inconsistency between the data. And you know the truth kind of lies in this murky middle, but how do you actually get to that? And if not get to it, how do you then give yourself confidence that what you're doing is going to actually be driving, you know, driving what you think it is?
Okay, that's like perfect, beautiful setup to actually talk about some of the experiments you guys have been running. So since we're going to put a couple of those sort of points on the screen, I think we might have Spotlight up first. So just to talk a bit about maybe the experiments and, like I know some of it's on platform, but the testing you've been doing over the last 12 months. And then we can talk a bit about how that's affected the way you view attribution, other pieces.
Yeah, so we have always done quite sporadic sort of brand and conversion lift tests. Just recently, prior to the new financial year, we ran a conversion lift test with Meta. So we had a 20% holdout group that received nothing for, I think, a 6-week period. And then we, just at an account level, we wanted to measure what that incrementality looked like on Meta versus people that were exposed and not exposed. So as you can see, we saw really great results here. The other part of this, though, as Joe was speaking to, is we do always look at our GA data, which we know underreports, especially when it comes to Meta. And then also combining that data with our metadata, which we know, does overinflate a little bit sometimes. So it's about finding that truth in the middle. And so what we were able to do with this test is find a multiplier number to apply to our GA results using this study, which allowed us to kind of find what that truth is, or get closer to it in the middle anyway. And that's something that we'll need to keep recalibrating over time. And so, moving forward, we're going to very regularly do this type of conversion lift testing.
Nice answer. So look, I know we did talk about this as part of the case study write-up. This is really about looking at a lot of it being lift versus attribution. But you weren't, obviously there's an offline effect as well. So I mean, I'm guessing about 90% of sales are in store, so.
Very high percentage of sales are in store for us, yep.
Okay, and so there was a crossover effect from online campaign to offline sales as well.
Yeah, we saw a really strong result for both online and omni-channel as well.
Okay. Cool. All right, let's have a little look. So your case is a little bit different in terms of lift and testing. So do you want to tell us a bit about what P&O's been covering?
Yes, as I was saying, we have this huge over-reliance on last touch. It means that, as a commercial team, week to week, we're sitting there looking at GA dashboards and seeing how performance is tracking. And as you can imagine, let's call it 75% of your weekly performance is coming from something that involved search, be it organic, direct, paid search. But we know that there's so much more, occurring. And so when you're having those conversations with senior management about can I have more budget to run across paid social, there's often a thing of how do you quantify it. So we devised this test that Meta kindly came to us with, where basically we set up a control group and you apply your UTM parameters, and you can kind of be pretty diverse in how you apply those. and essentially want to measure during kind of our second biggest campaign of the year, over a 4-week period, what is the lift, or how many of your search conversions was influenced by Meta. So you see this 38% lift from paid search traffic, which is great, it's what you'd expect to see. But I think the 11% of paid search sales influenced by exposure to Meta ads is the really interesting bit, because they are, when you look at it in Google Analytics, they're going to be attributed to paid search. And I'm not shitting on Google or Bing or but it's just because I know they're here. Apologies, but it's more that you want to be able to quantify it, right? And being able to do it in a really succinct, easy way for commercially minded people who are not from a marketing background. I think it's a really good indicator for them that top of funnel works. We're used to having those conversations about the long and the short of it, and they're used to like long-term brand building, but being able to actually show it in a kind of a more succinct way with a data point. And I think, to be honest, that 11%, that's all sales that included a click. That doesn't even include impressions. So how much of that is at an impression level? And this is where you start, it gets interesting trying to kind of marry the two and trying to work out what sits in the middle. But I mean, ultimately, it just gives you a confidence that your top of funnel activity is driving those bottom funnel conversions.
So maybe just to drill one of those a little bit further. So like obviously cruising, it's a relatively long purchase cycle to go from you saw an ad and then you're kind of committed and you've travelled and the rest of it. Can I ask how long that cycle is?
Yeah, it depends on the cruise length, but typically we're looking at about 6 weeks.
Okay, so for like a 7-day attribution window, that's a bit of a different story.
Absolutely, and you're going to lose, you've lost people along the way, cookie deprecation. So, actually being able to understand what they're, where they're coming in out of the journey, it's really important.
So you hinted there as well in terms of, I guess, talking to other stakeholders in the business about how these work. And obviously you've got a bunch of upper funnel things to do, and that's more in the brand sense. How are those conversations with those sort of more brand and upper funnel marketing teams?
I think it's the brand and upper funnel marketing teams get it, right? Because they're marketing. It's the commercial folk. Right, they're the revenue management guys, or the people, the data analysts who know nothing about marketing, and they just think that they sent an EDM and all of your sales is coming from them, from that EDM, right? So it's how do you educate them to start explaining? No, there's so many more touch points at work here than your EDM, I promise you. So it's how do you explain attribution to people that really don't get it? And that's really ultimately you have to talk their language. So, whatever that is, it's making sure that you can explain things in a kind of commercial revenue management kind of attitude.
Cool. I've got 3 or 4 more questions in terms of some broader stuff around future plans, but I probably should pause there for a second.
There's a question from Tom on the slide actually. So it's all well and good in terms of talking about experimentation and embracing failure and all that stuff. But ultimately, it's costly. So any tips in terms of how to manage costs, or do you just need to ascertain a budget to it that you're kind of willing to lose, as it were, or not see back immediately? Any tips on that?
What we look to when we're testing is just avoiding kind of peak sale periods, so minimising the risk that way. As you mentioned, looking at just kind of sectioning off portions of budget, and then also for a lot of testing, you can make the decision quite early on and then sort of pivot partway through the campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're doing a test, you have to kind of go into it accepting that you might lose it. It might not deliver what you want it to do, but that's the point of testing on budget, right?
Yeah. Finance don't like that though, do they?
No, they don't. That's why we don't tell them there's a 20% control in it.
Yeah, that's true. And just one quickly around. It came up earlier. Is likes no more? Is that a signal that doesn't matter? The social like. Do you count them? Do they count anymore? Came up earlier, you see. So just trying to rub it in a bit.
Looking straight past you at Andy Ford.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to look at Andy. Well, I was.
We probably spent the last 10 years trying to encourage people away from likes. Do I want to mention?
They're back. Anyway, I'll leave you with that one.
Thanks, JJ. I'm glad we asked you to come in. Well, look, a couple more maybe to close off with. So in terms of testing we've run this year, so what sort of comes next? Like from your point of view, is it more of the same? Is it different kinds of testing? Is it more about working with other tools alongside? What sort of happens from here?
So for us, we are constantly doing little A/B testing, especially when it comes to content. So we've got a very thorough testing program from that perspective. So we'll continue on there. We just completed this conversion uplift test for Spotlight, which was really handy because it was pre the start of this financial year, and it actually allowed us to make some budgeting changes for this year that we're in now. What we want to do is have more regular conversion lift tests for all of the brands. So that's something that we'll work to over the next 12 months, just to keep kind of recalibrating that data. And we're also just sort of dipping our toes in the water with MMM, which isn't anywhere near as overwhelming as I thought it would be. The meta guys have been really helpful from that perspective. Probably the hardest part is just kind of bringing all the data together, but we're just experimenting with that at the moment as well.
Cool. And future, Peter?
Yeah, just like everyone else, it sounds like we're just in the process of onboarding our MMM model. So that's obviously a big part of kind of our experimentation pipeline. But within, similar to what we've run already with the search lift study, I'm really keen to see, as we come into our peak selling period, mixing up between brand and generic, understanding brand and generic terms. So just seeing how deep we can go with that brand, that search lift study, because as I said, so much of our performance is attributed to last touch, and we're just probably not seeing the full picture. I think there's a whole lot more we can unpack there in with those kind of search lift studies and how it's affected by top of funnel.
All right, one last bit I didn't tell you guys about before bringing you on stage. I did manage to stick a couple of terms into generative AI to see what we could do in terms of producing a digital ad for a cruise liner and for a fabric craft and dressmaking. What do you think this is going to look like when I stick it up on screen?
COVID.
COVID. And for Spotlight, what do you think it's going to generate?
I'm expecting kind of like your science guy at the start, but it's a dressmaking kind of vibe instead. Okay. Crafty.
All right, so apparently if you merge together all of the known ads for cruise liner, you get something that looks a bit like that. And I think for fabric and dressmaking, we have, not terrible, but...
Could work. I'd run that. Cruise, not so much.
No, not so much.
We'll have to A/B test it.
All right, guys, again, a massive thanks from us for taking part and for being awesome partners in terms of incrementality and testing. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.